Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Today marks World Environment Day, and for that very reason, today should be spent with meaningful introspection. As cyclones and droughts become daily news, our air becomes more hazardous and our waters more murky. We must question ourselves, has our desire to progress materially cost us our environment? On tonight's show, we explore and discuss our relationship with our environment and what the future looks like. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Sven Harmeling, who's an expert on global policy leading on climate change. He's joining us from Germany. We're also joined by Ms. Jennifer Lavers, who is a research scientist at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies. She's joining us from Australia. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Sven, let me begin with you. Now, over the years, we're seeing many natural disasters taking place, many reports coming out that are alarming us to the situation that our environment is altering drastically. How do you see man's relationship with the environment today?
Yeah, I think what you're describing is a very big challenge for many people across this planet. And for example, my organization, CARE International, is working in over 90 countries, and we see how the deterioration of the environment, but also disasters, like you mentioned, make it more and more difficult for people to make their living, in particular the poorest people. I think what is very clear now, and science tells us over the place, is that in particular the emissions from burning fossil fuels accelerate climate change and results in a climate crisis, and further exacerbates disasters and the role that disasters, for example, play in contributing to poverty. So I think it's very important that we globally in every country shift course away from fossil fuels and turn to cleaner energy sources, so to cut the emissions. But at the same time, we need to do much more to better prepare for the disasters and the changes that are coming.
Right. And you mentioned here that we need to better prepare for the disasters that are coming. At this point, do you think that we're in any position to do so?
Well, I think there's positive and negative sides to it. I think over the last years, there's been a lot more awareness and also experience in terms of what can be done about preparing for disasters, what can be done about adapting to longer-term changes of the climatic system, like sea level rise, etc. So I think, and also in our work, for example, in countries in Africa or elsewhere, we see that there are solutions which can make a difference and which can make people and communities more resilient. But it's also clear if we don't manage to, tackle the root causes of the problem, in particular climate change, then the changes will be too overwhelming, and the solutions that may still work today may not work further in 5 or 10 years from now. We definitely need to do a lot of more, let's say, also testing out of solutions. We need to do much more sharing of experience and learning across all the planet. And also there needs to be much more investments into building the resilience of poor and vulnerable communities.
Right. And for hearing Mr. Sven talk about how we need to be more pragmatic for the future and how we need to have a greater foresight. Just moving back from that a little, now he also mentioned how fossil fuel emissions are contributing to the environment along with many other factors. Still, people are ambiguous as to whether climate change is completely a man-made phenomena or if there is nature at play here as well. Could you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I think climate change is not an area that I work in personally, but I consider myself really fortunate to work on another kind of global threat, and that's marine plastics. And I consider myself really fortunate because plastic is so visible. It's so undeniable, and it's in stark contrast to CO2, which is contributing in large part to climate change. CO2, you can't see, you can't smell, you can't taste. And so in many ways, it's taken us generations to convince the global community, or at least some members of the global community, that we should be taking this seriously. And so I think we've learned a lot of lessons from that, and I hope we can apply them to other major threats like plastic. But it's been interesting that I guess we haven't learned all of our lessons, because there is increasingly even pushback for plastics, which is just so obvious as a pollutant. You look at beaches around the world increasingly being contaminated with really significant quantities of plastic. And the science is telling us that the consequences of plastic on beaches in our oceans, in our wildlife, is significant, and not just for the oceans and for habitats, but for tourism, for economies.
Right.
And yet there is a growing sector of our society that is doubtful of whether or not plastic should be taken seriously, and, as you say, also doubtful of climate change. And so I think we have a lot of lessons still to learn, and I certainly hope we learn them a lot more quickly.
Right. And just to highlight how much of a threat plastic is to the environment, to the marine life, there are many predictions that say that by 2050 there will be more plastic in the oceans than fish. Now, is that a realistic prediction given how we are proceeding right now?
Well, yeah, the short answer is yes. I guess future predictions are always a bit of a challenge, depending on how much data you have underpinning them.
Right.
But I think we can also look back in time, at least with the plastics literature, to kind of look at the trajectory or the changes that have already taken place in such a short period of time. So, for example, if we look just at marine species, which many of them are widely regarded as what we call indicator or sentinel species. So scientists around the world accept that these species can tell us a lot about the health of the oceans, and in a really consistent and reliable way. And so if we look at some of these species and we look at the proportion of individuals within that species that have been consuming plastic from the ocean over time, about 20 or 25 years ago, we were talking in the range of about 250 marine species were known to be consuming plastic. And as of 2019, that number has grown rapidly to more than 2,400 marine species now negatively impacted by marine plastic. Right. So I don't think we even need to make so many future predictions. I think we can just look at where we currently are and where we know where we've come from.
Right. And that's a very important point you're making, that instead of just focusing on future predictions, understanding how bad of a state we are in right now can actually create the urgency needed to make real meaningful steps. Mr. Svein, I put this question to Jennifer earlier, and it was regarding the fact that is climate change completely a man-made phenomena, or whether it's a part of nature's way of progressing, if that makes sense. And this is a question that is heard by many people having this debate who might not know the science behind it. Shed some light on that for us, please.
Yeah, I think unfortunately that is still a challenge, that there are more doubts in the public than the science actually reflects. I mean, there's been studies which show that 97% of the scientific articles on climate change are very clear and agree that man, in particular through burning fossil fuels, is the main source of the changes we're seeing and the drivers. Of course, there's always interrelations with natural variabilities, but the fact is very clear. It's established science, and now the debate has to be about what do we need today, what can we do today to really trigger the changes we need, and the speed of it. We cannot waste another 10 years by discussing, do we want to do something or not? And that's basically a challenge in every country and a task for every country. But I think I'm also positive in the sense that we see more and more movements by citizens, by students, etc., basically understanding and also feeling the impacts of climate change basically in their daily life. And I think the mood is shifting, and the pressure is really now on business and on governments to tackle this serious right now.
Of course, and you're talking about the movements that have been gaining momentum, but of course it's always important to make sure that all segments of society are taken in to the envelope of change, and they are made to progress with them. Another doubt that I'd like your take on is the fact that nature itself is supposed to adapt to evolution, and in fact, humans are supposed to adapt to whatever the changing environment is. So whatever happens in the future, human will be able to adapt to it. Do you think that is a logical take on what's happening?
Well, I think some level of confidence in the ability of nature and the humans to adapt to changes is of course fair and makes sense. But I think we're also seeing that we see a lot of stressors on the environment. Basically, climate is changing at a speed which natural systems are basically not used to adapt to, and I think that's one of the challenges. And the challenges also the colleague described in terms of the interlinkages between different crises, biodiversity loss, development challenges, pollution. I think that is a real crisis situation which needs to be tackled right now, and we can.
So would you say that the changes that are occurring at this point in time are happening at an unnatural pace?
Definitely. I mean, all the statistics show that without men being on this planet and let's say accelerating some of the changes, they wouldn't be severe and then nature would have time to adapt. But that's not the situation we're in. So basically, that's why we need to do a lot of activities to accelerate the adaptation solutions we have. But as I said earlier, without limiting climate change, limiting global warming to the 1.5 degrees, which governments agreed to in the Paris Agreement, the changes will become unmanageable on large scale.
Right. And we're going to talk about the policies that are needed to be implemented globally later on in the show. But before that, Ms. Jennifer, just to discuss the contribution of humans and the extent to which they damage the environment, a new study found that 91 rivers that were studied, 2/3 of those were polluted with antibiotics. Now, this is just one example of how water is being polluted. Tell us the extent of it. Tell us exactly what's happening. Give us your expert opinion on that.
That's an excellent example. So rivers are facing a kind of a deluge of pressures. So it's not just climate change and plastics in the marine environment, and it's also not just antibiotics in our rivers. It's plastic pollutants, it's other chemical contaminants, and also physical contaminants. It's things that many of us sometimes would never even really consider. So, for example, noise pollution, ship traffic, all of these kinds of things are coming in and out of our river systems, and they're rarely happening in isolation of one another, and yet science, largely because we lack time or funding, tends to study these things one at a time, but they're definitely happening at the same time. And so the challenge is really to try and put all those pieces of the puzzle together and envision what a river system or what the ocean or what a species is actually experiencing in its day-to-day life, and therefore what it might experience moving into the future when there are more ships, there are more antibiotics, there are more of all of these things putting pressure on the system.
Right, and you've mentioned a plethora of factors that are going into polluting the environment. So the question that arises is that if today we decide magically that everyone in the world is going to live in a more sustainable way, is it even too late now at this point in time to make that change?
Well, I think even if someone wanted to throw their hands up and say it was too late, I think that's never a good enough reason to do nothing. I think we should always make whatever changes we feel are necessary, simply because on principle, that is what we should do. We should always live by sustainable principles. And I think increasingly science in various areas of science are pointing to the fact that we are rapidly running out of time and approaching these things that we kind of call tipping points. It's so hard to know what those tipping points are. They're not things that you can kind of put your finger directly on, but I think the sense of urgency is definitely there. So any and all changes that we can be making, we should. And really, the solutions to some of our problems, not all, are not always as complex or as expensive as we think. So if I to draw another example to the marine pollution space, which I know so well, rivers are inundated with plastic all around the world, and yet some really quite simplistic, affordable technology has put in place everything from something we call GPTs, or gross pollutant traps, to something called the Baltimore Water Wheel, which is now being implemented in cities around the world, have been put in place and proven extremely effective at removing and diverting significant quantities of the waste so that it doesn't end up out in the ocean.
Right.
And so I don't think we should throw our hands up. I don't think we should say it's too late. We should continue to innovate and try harder.
And you make a very important point there that we shouldn't give up, and on an individual level too, we should do as much as we can. But this question that seems to always arise when we're watching the politics play out regarding climate change is that even if an individual wants to do what they can, policymakers might hinder their cause. And do you think that that's a trend that you're seeing rising across the world?
Well, I mean, policymakers may stall things on a large scale for a while, but I highly doubt it will always be that way. And it will change because the momentum of the people changes. So continue to do your individual switches and changes to living a more sustainable life, bring others on board, increase that momentum. There will be a transition point where policy governments will follow suit and follow into line. And I mean, the only thing that guarantees we won't change and won't have the outcome that so many of us wish for is if we don't lead the lives that we wish for ourselves. If we don't lead by example, that will get us nowhere.
Right. And thank you for that, Ms. Jennifer Lavers, joining us and talking to us. We're also joined by now Mr. Svein Tveidal, who's the former UN Director of Climate Change. He's joining us from Oslo. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Tveidal. Now, before we were talking to our other guest who is with us right now, too, Mr. Harmeling, about the fossil fuel emissions and how he sees that as being one of the main, if not the main cause for the accelerated rate in climate change. Do you see it the same way? And do you think that where we stand today, there is enough action being taken place against fossil fuel emissions?
No, definitely not. And of course, this is the main cause for the problems we have. UN has said that we should, in the Paris Agreement, that we should limit global warming to 2 centigrades and try to limit it to 1.5. If we should do that to 1.5, we need to reduce emissions we need to halve emissions by 2030, which means that we have to reduce emissions by 18% every year, and that is not possible. So this will not happen. If we are going to limit it to 2 degrees, which is it is still a big challenge. Instead of reducing emissions, we saw in 2018 a new record for the world. Emissions increased by some 2.3%. India topped the list with more than 6%. After that, China, and after that, US. So it is actually now, if this trend continues, as likely that we would see a warming on 5 centigrades by the end of the century than that we could stop it at 2. And 5 degrees is definitively environmental and climate catastrophe. But that is the reality. This is where we are. As of now, the globe is warming by approximately 0.2 centigrades per decade, and it is only accelerating. So we are in a big trouble.
Right. And Mr. Harmeling, if we talk about what Mr. Tveidal just painted for us, the picture that he painted for us, he is creating the sense of alarmism, and rightfully so. He's saying that a record number of emissions were released this year alone. But to talk about the responsibility and how to move forward, an Oxfam report released figures stating that the richest 10% of people produce half of Earth's climate-harming fossil fuel emissions, while the poorest half contribute a mere 10%. Now, when we're talking about responsibility, how does it need to be proportional to these figures that I've just stated?
Yeah, I think. Let me start off with an earlier question. I think it's definitely important to highlight that every tenth of degree increase, centigrade increase that can be avoided is worth fighting for. So, and I totally agree with the picture that Mr. Tveidal painted, that we are really in big trouble, but we cannot put our hands in the sand. We really need to tackle this crisis. I think in terms of your second question, it's definitely clear that the richer parts of the world, and that includes developed countries like where I'm from, but it also includes, let's say, vibrant middle class and upper class in many poorer countries, that our footprint is not sustainable. So we also need to be among the leaders, changing course in our own consumption, but also in, let's say, for example, getting policymakers to adopt legislation which shifts the energy sources to renewables. Just, I think, yesterday, the International Renewable Energy Agency released a report which highlighted again how the costs of renewables have gone down. And this also opens opportunities for tackling energy poverty, for example, and building more sustainable poverty reduction as well. But I think there are also a number of other issues, like, for example, international transport, that aviation, that flying has become so cheap in many parts of the world that people get used to a way of flying which is not sustainable. So I think there are many issues to tackle, and the richer parts of the world have the largest responsibility to tackle this.
And you're saying that they have the largest responsibility to do it, but do they have the political will?
Well, I think not yet sufficiently, but I think as any other aspect in society, there are different views, different opinions, and I also sense more and more awareness in, let's say, for example, in the business community, even among, let's say, celebrities, that there's an understanding, okay, this is not something we can just ignore, and we have to see what our responsibilities are. But I think
Mr.
it's clear that
just hold on to that thought. I want to read out a tweet for you. I know this person isn't the best to quote when it comes to climate change, but it really does show how the highest policymakers in office take this trend. Donald Trump in January stated in a tweet, in the beautiful Midwest, wind chill temperatures are reaching minus 60 degrees, the coldest ever recorded. In coming days, expected to get even colder. People can't last outside even for minutes. What the hell is going on with global warming? Please come back fast. We need you. Now, I know this is often passed around in jest, but the reason why I'm highlighting this and why it's important is that a report in the New York Times just came out, and it also stated how in the US there are increasing efforts being made to debunk climate change science. Now, when this sort of politics is occurring, can we actually be optimistic about the future?
I think one has to see that Donald Trump and the current U.S. administration is really in an isolationist position here. More than 180 countries have ratified the Paris Agreement. Even in the U.S., there's a lot of initiatives from cities, from business, etc., to fight back against this rollback which the U.S. administration is envisaging. Of course, it's dangerous what they are doing, but I also want to stress they shouldn't serve as an example in terms of where the global direction is. Instead, we need to join efforts to basically build up the pressure from on the ground that such rollback is not possible, because it's coming close to a climate crime, because if you don't tackle climate change, many millions and billions of people will suffer from it, so we can't just ignore it.
Right. And on that point, thank you so much, Mr. Harmeling, for joining us and talking to us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special while we continue our discussion. And we're now continuing with Mr. Svein Tveidal. Mr. Svein, before we went for a break, our guest previously stated that the U.S. has an isolationist position. It's the only country that is adopting this view against climate change. But if we keep in mind that the global subsidies given to fossil fuel companies is $5 trillion, can we just blame the U.S.?
No. Not at all. And when you mention the figure $5 trillion, just to say it in another way, it is actually more than 6% of the global GDP. So it is enormous. And it is 5 times higher than the subsidies on renewable energy. It is actually in the hands of the politicians to turn this around. And it was not the US, it was China that had the highest subsidies for fossil fuels last year. Interesting enough, when you talked about what can we do, the last report is saying that if there was a fair pricing of fossil fuels, that you took away the subsidies, that alone would reduce global emissions by 28%. So I think actually to deal with the reduction or take out the fossil fuel subsidies is the most important thing and most efficient thing that politicians can do as of now.
Right.
Then you have the other positive trends with the technology and so forth. That is more in the hands of the industry.
Right. And Mr. Svein Tveidal, just picking up on that point you mentioned, that the subsidies given to fossil fuels are 5% higher than those for renewable energies. What is the logic behind that?
The logic is that there is an enormous pressure on keeping on with subsidizing fossil fuels from the fossil industry. You know, if we should limit warming to 2 centigrades, we need to keep 80% of the known reserves of coal, oil and gas in the ground as stranded assets. And physically these resources are in the ground, but economically they are already taken up in the balance of the fossil fuel companies. So there is this enormous pressure to keep on here. If not, if you have to realize that 80% of the known resources need to stay in the ground, there will be tremendous economic problems for the fossil fuel industry. This is the main reason, because of the impact they have on policy.
Right.
That is probably also the reason you talked about Trump just a while ago and the policy that we see there.
Right, and of course you're telling us how the lobby is strong there and they are influencing policy. Now, with that, when we're talking about the system where policy makers are influenced by funding while we live in a capitalist society, do you believe that there needs to be economic incentives given to tackling climate change, as opposed to just relying on those who are aware about the situation and who actually care about the future? Do you think that in this business model we live in, there needs to be business-oriented solutions?
Yes, to take an example, which I fully agree in, just 2 days ago, the Secretary General in the US, Guterres, told the R20, he was actually together with Greta Thunberg, which you show, and Schwarzenegger. He said that these subsidies of the fossil energy is destroying the world. And he said you should tax pollution, not people. And that is the way to go. And that is what policymakers need to immediately put in action. I agree with the previous speaker that there is an awareness that is rising quite fast in the world now, which could make us optimistic. But still, the pace of the change from a fossil economy to a renewable economy goes way too slow. So the problem is still enormous, but there are hope and there are possibilities. And
And Mr. Tveidal, just hold on to that point. I want to talk about awareness and policy-making solutions a little more, but before that, I'd like to introduce another guest who's joined us, Ms. Alison Teal, who's a councillor of the Green Party, joining us from the UK. Thank you so much, Ms. Alison, for joining us. Now, as we're talking about subsidies given to fossil fuels, let's talk about what's happening in Europe and also in in the UK. Since 2009, G7 and G20 have committed to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. Yet, according to a report from the European Commission, the report warned that the total subsidies that are given are the same as they were in 2008. So no real efforts are being made on this front. Tell us more about the situation.
Well, there's definitely a lack of investment going into renewable energy to offset the use of carbon. So we need to put a lot more money into that. Unfortunately, the UK government has been reducing subsidies that encouraged people to use solar and wind power. So less investment is going into renewable energy, and that's a huge problem. In fact, they're even have encouraged the use of shale gas. So fracking is actually, they're attempting to increase the fracking industry in the UK when they need to be actually legislating against fracking, and they need to actually be increasing renewable energy investment.
Right. But Ms. Alison, you mentioned the UK is trying to reduce subsidies, but in this commission report that I talked about, the UK leads in the European Union in giving subsidies to fossil fuels. What real measures are they taking?
Well, clearly it's tremendously insufficient. The fossil fuel lobby has a tremendous impact on the Parliament here. And very little is being done to actually redirect funding to renewable energy, which is what we need to see. If we're not increasing the production of renewable energy, we're not going to be able to do without fossil fuels. And that's the dilemma, is that there's a lot of money and a lot of lobbying power in the fossil fuel industry, which is still has tremendous influence in Westminster. It's a huge problem that we're constantly lobbying against.
And how does one perceive a future in which this power of this very, very powerful fossil fuel lobby can be broken or can be countered?
I think it has to be, it's a political decision. It has to be made by politicians. Politicians have to realize that, yes, the IPCC report made it very clear that we have no choice. And that needs to be translated into political action. So the politicians need to actually say to the fossil fuel companies that we can't keep on using your products. We have to increase investment in renewables. And I can imagine a scenario where fossil fuel companies themselves might lead the way in the production of renewable energy. That's entirely a possible thing for them to do, so that they can still make vast profits and still be very successful companies. And that's what we need to encourage. And we can only encourage that through political will and legislation.
And do you think that the political will, the momentum for green politics is increasing in that part of the world, in the European sphere?
Yes, that's what we've seen in the European elections, haven't we? That we've seen that the number of MEPs has risen by about 20, which is really exciting. So that gives us a much stronger lobby group within the European Parliament to bring about those political changes, to actually add pressure to the governments that are being quite resistant about reducing their use of fossil fuels. So that's very, very encouraging.
Right. And Mr. Tveidal, just going back to and on the point of how politics needs to intervene in this and how politics needs to lead this. Now, citing an example of India, the largest democracy in the world recently went through elections. And all the opinion polls talked about the main voter concerns, which were regarding employment, which were regarding security, et cetera, et cetera. None of them mentioned environment or climate change as a main concern. And this isn't just unique to India. This is a problem across the developing world where you're seeing other concerns taking precedence before this. Now, in these parts of the world, how do you create that awareness?
Well, if you go to India as an example, then the emissions are very low per capita. So, when I worked with the UN, we had many developing countries coming to us, and they said to us that, well, we will do like you did. We will explore our resources, and then we will clean up afterwards. And it is not so easy to say that you should not do that. On the other hand, India and China, they have huge pollution problems, which is in a way combined with the CO2 emissions, and renewable energy is getting cheaper and cheaper. So I think they have to be encouraged and helped and see the in a way, wise thing in doing this green shift fast. And I know that these, both China and India, they are aware of what is happening, and I believe that they can do it. It depends a little bit now on how the trend goes on awareness and so forth. And you talked about Europe just a while ago, and in the Union, as an example, and when we talked about subsidies, then, for instance, in Germany now, green subsidies are higher than fossil, and that is a political, in a way, step, and maybe that can be increased. But I think also the rest of the world has to come to support, for instance, to countries like India to boost their transition into a green economy, and that is good for the world and good for India.
Right. And Ms. And while we're talking about this, what the world needs to do collectively, what do you think the next step is? What we see in the past is that countries come and discuss the issue, but there never seems to be any real collaboration taking place on an international scale. How do you think that can change, and do you think that will change?
I think that what we're seeing now is a lot of pressure on governments from voters, and that people are really making a big stand now. In the UK, we've had a lot of action from the group called Extinction Rebellion, that you're probably familiar with, and of course the very famous schoolgirl, wonderful young woman Greta Thunberg. And these sorts of movements, these grassroots movements to demand change from governments, I think is going to have an impact. I think it's going to increase dramatically. It has to increase dramatically so that governments finally see that this is the will of the people. And we have this massive emergency that we must address. You know, we keep calling it an emergency. It's, the risks are very, very high. And so governments have to reorient themselves very quickly. And governments aren't well known for that, unfortunately. Things don't tend to happen quickly in politics. But I think because of the grassroots pressure, I'm hoping that that's going to actually happen.
Right, and you did mention how there is pressure on governments to take action, and that can be manifested in the fact that even in the U.S., the 2020 elections, for the Democrats at least, climate change seems to be a central issue. But with that, a question that would arise is that when politics and something like climate change interferes or intervenes together, what could be the possible issues with that? Will this issue just become more politicized? Will scientific data be meddled in with? Will it just become dirty politics?
Well, we have seen that, haven't we, in the US? I think that Donald Trump is clearly a climate denier, and that's a massive problem. And so, unless the politicians around him, unless the opposition groups are much more forceful and use the scientific data, which I think a lot of countries. Donald Trump's quite unusual, isn't he, in the way that he responds to facts. But most countries are quite responsive to the facts. It's about people just making it really clear that we can't tolerate this. We want a future for our children, and if we don't make the changes, then that's not going to happen. And so I think that the political will is the most important issue here. Without the political will, we won't have the changes. And so the people have to drive the politicians into having that political will to make a difference and to actually begin to invest in renewable energy and all those things that need to happen. Better public transport, less cars on the road. There's many things that we need to do. So many things we need to change simultaneously, which is massively challenging. I appreciate that, but it has to happen.
Right. And Mr. Tveidal, while we're talking about the political will and everything that needs to happen there, just from the economics end, do you think that there needs to be more funding on managing disaster management, and globally, developed countries need to pour in their resources to developing nations. They need to provide assistance and aid. Do you think that needs to happen, and how do you think that could possibly happen? That
definitely really needs to happen. And back to your question about India, which is threatened by this. One way of solving the problem is through the Paris Agreement. And according to the Paris Agreement, the rich countries should provide $1 billion a year for both mitigation and adaptation. And again, it's not a big figure in a global picture, but still that is one of the things that the Paris Agreement so far haven't managed to establish. So here is a solution. At least follow the Paris Agreement to help the developing countries to adapt and mitigate. And as we talked about earlier, if politicians are removing the subsidies, we will have a 28% reduction from today just through this, which is extremely important.
And that would extremely benefit the environment, of course. Ms. Alison, just a quick question for you. Are you optimistic about the future here? And do you think that we're moving on the right path if we continue this momentum of green politics?
Absolutely, yes. I'm completely optimistic. I think there's a lot of hope around. I think that there are a lot of good politicians coming through the system that are going to make a big difference. And I think we have reason to hope. We do need to increase that momentum. We must act much, much faster. But I can feel it growing and it's exciting.
Right. And thank you so much, Alison Teal, for joining us and talking to us. Thank you so much, Mr. Svein Tveidal, for talking to us and shedding light on this issue. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.